Gravel shifted in my shoes, between my toes, and dirt in my pockets, fine as ash. The further I shuffled over the earth, the wider it became, stretching like a rotted hide towards the mountains. My knees were bleeding again. I began to see the forms flickering, phantoms of the land on either side of the road. Is it trying to tell me something? To manifest in corporal form, to warn me in a language I'll understand?
Now that Michael Spinell has returned, 7 years later, to the site where this story happened, he thinks he is finally ready to talk about the long walk of June 2009.
Not much has changed. I thought they would have blocked more of this off, put up more no trespassing signs. What's to stop somebody else from coming here? It's not responsible.
In May of that year, Michael was a biology undergraduate at Lakeland College in Alberta, Canada, unsure of what to do with himself during the coming summer break. He saw an interesting handwritten ad posted on a bulletin board in the student union and tore a phone number slip from it. In messy script, it invited anyone who wanted to join a silent group meditation hike on something called the Strong Bone Road north of Fort St. John to call for more information.
I'd never heard of the place. I was from Michigan. I had to look it up. But I was into hiking and walking and a lot of New Age stuff, so I made the call. A guy named Peter Ricks answered the phone. He sort of talked in a very slow, hard-to-hear way, a monotone. He said the walk was going to be pretty ambitious. He wanted to do all 130 miles of the road with just enough other people to make it physically safe to do it. I'd never done more than 50 miles. But the road was perfectly flat, and the weather would be probably, very mild.
Peter Ricks accentuated that he wanted to observe silence as they went, with each of the hikers practicing their own meditation individually. That was fine with Michael. After the recent death of a close friend, a breakup and problems in school, a week walking mindlessly in silence and in the middle of absolutely nowhere sounded like a good idea. Gail Greenlove has been Chief Constable of the Fort St. John Police Department since 2008.
The Strongbone Road went from Rose Prairie almost to Fort Nelson. It was constructed in the 60s, jointly by 2 trucking companies, by special lease from the government of Alberta. It only had the one purpose, and that was to haul petrochemicals between 2 facilities. To call it a road was actually generous. It was unlined white asphalt. No signage, no signs of life for the whole length through the plain west of Kanta. And just flat and empty. It became impassable in winter very fast, and Balcafta Oil and Chase Colney didn't want to spend a lot of money maintaining it from year to year. There was no outside traffic except for emergency vehicles. They had planned an extension all the way to Nelson Forks, but it wasn't ever funded. Then in 1986 or 1987, I forget which, Chase Colney went bust, and the road became completely unused, more or less. By the mid-90s, it was abandoned.
Peter Ricks called Michael 2 weeks after their first contact to confirm that he still wanted to go on the walk. There would be just 2 other people on it, both women who lived near the Lakeland campus and had responded to the ad. They would meet in Goodloe on the night of June 2nd and start out the next day.
I was worried about water, mostly. But Peter said it would be okay because the road was dotted with pumps, which the government required to be in operation for safety reasons. And there were lakes not too far away, so that was okay. Our packs had to be kind of heavy to carry food for 5 days, so I was hoping my legs could take it. I made sure to talk to some friends about precautions to take. All of them thought I was insane. They thought The boredom factor would send me off the road in 2 days, but I didn't have anything to lose at all.
Michael drove to Gwillem Lake Provincial Park and camped out there, then drove on to Goodloe to meet his walking companions in a diner just outside of town. Peter Rix was a tall, morose-looking man in his early 40s, with a deep bass voice that made it sound, as it had on the phone, like he'd never had a day of joy in his life. He wore a T-shirt bearing the cheerful image of the advertising icon known as Kool-Aid Man. He would also wear it the next day when the hike started, a detail Michael would not forget. He did not ask for the reasons any of them were there. Also going along was Shannon Francis.
Shannon was really energetic. She sort of bristled with it, like she was always caffeinated. Very well spoken and philosophical. I think she questioned everything about life, but in a very wide open, childlike way, a healthy way.
Finally, there was Emma Bailey, who seemed to give conflicting information about what she did for a living. Michael couldn't quite piece together whether she was a coffee roaster, a veterinary assistant, or a full-time student.
She had a strange stare about her, and sometimes she'd lapse into a silence in the middle of a thought and just gaze at the table. She had this very shrill, nervous laugh, and she was always fussing with the tangles in her hair endlessly. It was really long. She didn't eat anything at all. The rest of us were really loading up, but I think she had a soda. That was it.
The walk was not technically legal. The Strongbone Road was considered under the jurisdiction of the government, and it had banned all travel on it to avoid liability, which was understandable. The only other real concern for them, aside from, the occasional coyote, was what they called the Yanni plant. It grew wild in that area, and it would give you a similar effect to a mild hallucinogenic mushroom. If the roots reach a certain temperature, which happened in late spring and summer. It wasn't tremendously powerful, so there wasn't even a trade in it, but 1 or 2 truckers back in the day would tell you it could cause a pretty catastrophic misperception of direction, so you had to watch out. They chewed it a bit as an upper, mostly just for something to do out there. It could get viciously boring on the road.
The next morning we had a ride coming to take us from the motel. And just before we got there, I was in my room just kind of staring out the window. It was still dark. The sun wasn't quite up. And I saw Emma sitting in a chair on the sidewalk outside her room. The lights were still on in the parking lot. And some guy was slowly moving away from her, and he was talking back at her really aggressively as he moved. It was like they'd been having an argument. I could just make him out saying one sentence. He was saying, "If I have to go to the police about you, I will." Then he disappeared into one of the rooms. No idea who he was. She could only have just met him. So I waited a bit, and I took my backpack, and I went out there to say hello. And it was almost like she didn't even remember who I was. It was still kind of dark when we came up this way, so I don't remember too much of the scenery, but we were all amazed at how the trees just stopped suddenly, and it was just this scrub and desert for about 10 miles before we even got there. It doesn't feel like that long now. So the access road is gone now. That's one difference. It was totally in a shambles. It was blocked off by these big, long cement barriers. We were let out right here, and there was a signpost with nothing on it except a bunch of engineering statistics, not even the name of the place or the names of the companies. And Peter told us that those silo-looking storage buildings out there All the way out there, it's a bit too hazy to make them out too well. They were all that was left of Chase Colney. Literally a ghost town.
The Strongbone Road went north toward the horizon and disappeared into it. It was 60 feet wide, white and gray, unlined. The scene looked to Michael like a child's minimalist drawing of a landscape. No trees, no brush, no rocks. Only the faintest long tendrils of scrub wandering across the road's surface like searching fingers. The four of them checked their supplies, and Peter released the driver, who turned around and disappeared quickly in a cloud of dust. Some sort of introductory remark from Peter was expected, perhaps a cheerful quotation or inspiring comment, but instead he simply hoisted his pack and began to walk, and they all lapsed immediately into the silence that had been informally legislated. Emma's tattered pack seemed to Michael to be way too big for her. Shannon's had been custom fit for her at some expense at REI. Peter's looked incredibly well worn, as if he'd had it with him all his life. Michael had borrowed his brother's, and had received several withering warnings about carrying too heavy a load. But the weight of his burden never even had a chance to become a real problem. Of far greater concern, he would learn only long after his ordeal, was the people he was walking with.
Shannon Francis was from Claysmore. Her husband had died 2 years before in a helicopter crash, and soon after that, she discovered his secret life. He had a secret family that happened to be buried under a mountain of debt. Since then, she'd been raising their son alone. He was 10. She had very little money. She'd been working as a yoga instructor. And she'd been teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown for about 18 months.
Her son's name was Connor, an extraordinarily volatile child. He was given to intense tantrums and ostracized by other children. Shannon had gone into therapy to fight off bouts of intense depression. Her relentless activism and many social activities kept her sane. But shortly before the posting for the walk had appeared, she hit bottom and fled to the mountains for a week after dropping Connor off at her parents' house. She stayed in a small, open, wooden shelter and almost became fatally lost in the wilderness. Weeks later, neighbors had found her wandering a road near her house in a daze after getting into a screaming match with her son about a trip to the mall, during which he threw a wall mirror almost as big as she was down a staircase at her. She had clung to the walk as her longest escape yet from the nightmare her life had suddenly become.
3 days before she left for Goodloe, the police had come to question Connor about the whereabouts of a neighborhood boy from 3 doors down who hadn't come home for dinner. They slowly wore down his lies, and he led them deep into the woods. That was where he tied the boy to a tree and left him there in 35-degree weather about 4 hours before. Miss Francis had collapsed on the floor and begun to claw at her face so badly she'd had to be tranquilized.
After about maybe 4 hours, I was thinking about my brother and how he said I'd go crazy with boredom because the scenery was completely unchanging. The road had no deviation or turns at all. They'd cut it intentionally that way so there wouldn't be any obstructions, no rises, no falls. They wanted to save gas, right? There were no hills. Every step felt exactly identical to the one before it. The only thing that varied was the strands of the yawny plant. They were all over the road. It was peeking between the cracks in the asphalt even. But beyond that, you got this sense real fast that your path was meaningless. You may as well have been walking on a treadmill with a fake sky as a backdrop on a scroll. And that was disorienting. I'd never seen terrain like this before. There was something about it that was unbearably bleak. I'd figured the mountains might be a reference point, but they were too far away. We couldn't see them.
There were no real breaks. The group had all agreed to keep moving freely any time someone else stopped for water or food or to walk off the road a bit for whatever reason. And the 4 of them had all broken apart substantially by mid-afternoon. No one wanted to rest together. It was quiet and isolation they had all bought into, and that is exactly what they got. Contact with the outside world would be very difficult, as cell phone reception on the plane was almost non-existent.
At one point I was sitting there eating almonds at a fruit bar or something, and when I looked back and forward, I was totally alone. Just me in the desert thinking, okay, this is going to be tougher than I thought. Not physically, mentally. Eventually, Emma walked past me. She didn't even look at me. This is one of the spigots. They were every 10 miles or so, I think. You can see how it blends into the landscape. You could walk right past it if you weren't careful. Still working. The water is kind of warm and awful, but it's drinkable. I was standing here filling one of my bottles and I felt something on my ankle brushing my skin, and I looked down and I saw a thick strand of the yawny scraping me above my sock. And I cringed and I kicked it away. It was totally irrational. And this is where I more or less stopped seeing Peter, when he was filling up too. After that, at first, I thought, well, he just doesn't need much rest, but he's out there somewhere, up ahead. I would see Shannon up ahead. And then I would pass her, and then she would catch up to me. It went on and on like that. But right away, Peter got way, way ahead. That was a little scary. He was supposed to be the leader of this thing, and he was basically gone. That first day, Emma was the first one to stop. She put a mat down and turned on her side. She was using her pack as a pillow. That was about an hour after night fell. She didn't even bother pitching her tent. And Peter had told us back at the diner that there were wild animals sometimes out there, but she didn't seem to care. Then a few miles later, I spotted Shannon. And she was way off the road, and she'd built a fire. She'd taken some classes on outdoor survival back when she was a real hippie, she said. She always smiled at me when I passed her. I kept going for as long as I could. I had a one-person tent with a big hole in it. I think I only slept for a couple hours. And my dreams consisted of one thing, which was a repeating horizontal pattern of black and yellow, like my brain had a loose wire. That was it, very foreign and weird. I was cold, my feet really hurt bad. And I wondered what my mind would be like after another 2 or 3 days on this awful road.
When Emma Bailey was 15 years old, she ran away from home and an abusive stepmother. She lived in the woods for 7 months while she worked at a series of minimum wage jobs in Calgary. One day she snuck into a summer carnival and merely wandered around, taking in the sights, too poor to afford the rides. At around dusk, headed off the property, she tried to take a shortcut between 2 big tents. She would later tell a psychiatrist that she remembered seeing a dark, evolving shape come out from behind one of them, and that is where her memories ended for some time. She was found in a field a mile away 3 weeks later, with strange gray bruises all over her arms, but otherwise unhurt. Upon waking in the hospital, she was from that point on terrified of small rooms and seeing anything moving in the sky above her. Depression led her to chronic poverty, homelessness, vagrancy, arrests for petty theft and assault. From age 16 to 24, she was in and out of support groups for those who believed they had been abducted by aliens. She spent her 25th year in a psychological care facility after setting fire to several buildings at a lumber yard. She claimed she had retreated there because the aliens were coming back for her and had ringed the property, unseen, trapping her there. Upon her release, she worked at a car wash and then, in May of 2009, she responded to an ad to go hiking along the Strongbone Road. She had never held a job for more than 8 months, being prone to conflicts with her co-workers, and 2 men had filed restraining orders against her since 2004. Among her possessions after the hike ended was found a trove of 30 sketches she had made over the years of the moment when that dark shape had appeared before her at the carnival. She had also spent countless hours clumsily sketching vast open plains with featureless white skies. In the opinion of one psychiatrist, this was the geography in which Emma felt safest, able to run from danger in all directions.
The very worst stories I've heard or been a part of, it seems like there were 3 or 4 tragic factors somehow coming together at once. It's not one person or 1 or 2 factors converging. It's more than that. It's a mix of the wrong personalities and situations. And when you look back at the events, you're stunned at the chances of so many scary elements converging. So many coincidences.
I would say it was maybe noon of the next day that I began to really worry about the Peter thing. No sign of him, and I felt like we had no one watching out for us. Not that he was supposed to be even doing that, but that was the feeling I got. None of us were saying anything, of course, and we were getting further and further away from each other, so I'd go 2 or 3 hours easy without seeing Shannon or Emma. And I wasn't even keeping track of the miles or the time at that point. I was just dragging myself along. My mind couldn't get settled. There was no peaceful aspect to the walking, just this mental Novocaine sensation. The weather was exactly the same as the first day. It was just more empty steps. My energy didn't last very long. I decided to crawl into my tent and sleep a bit and then maybe walk through the night. I figured that would be a good way to catch up to Peter, hopefully. We didn't have to talk or anything. I just wanted to see him, make sure he hadn't abandoned us. I woke up a little before dusk. It was raining very, very lightly. And I sat up fast because I saw a shadow above my tent. It was real close, like right outside the tent. And as soon as I sat up, it moved away fast. And I heard footsteps. But for some reason, I was afraid to even peer out the flap to see who that had been. I just sat there until my heart stopped pounding. What was I afraid of? And when I did look out, there was no one out there. The sky was gray, no sun again that day, and it was getting dark. I was getting paranoid and not like myself at all. That fear made no sense whatsoever, but it was there.
Nadia Oliver is a professor of chemistry at the University of Lethbridge.
Well, I think what happened would have made sense if you consider what you really had, which was a group of people suddenly on very low rations, getting physically weaker with each passing day, and walking in a place none of them knew, where the sense of progress was removed because of the landscape. Plus no communication between them at all, or with the outside world. If when all that was established, the yoni plant were to be ingested toward the height of potency, the warm weather, ingested by weakened and dehydrated people, then the effects would likely have been very powerful.
The problem is that the toxicology reports just didn't show it. They just didn't. Not one of those people had any yoni in their system when they were found, and it couldn't possibly have gotten out of their system so quickly. So you're left with an impossible scenario. You're left with more than a few instances of behavior and memories that don't add up together.
I wasn't even considering it. that just wasn't something I was into. That kind of stuff had always scared me. So on day 2, no, I had no intention of biting into that stuff. How would I even know what part of the plant had any effect? But you can see how they skitter and move, the strands. This was the only motion we saw, maybe a bird once in a while. But this stuff was like a secondhand presence. It was like I wasn't walking alone. I could hear it if I concentrated, skittering across the asphalt, but I may have been imagining that. Anyway, I got a little obsessed. I started trying not to step on it. So every 100 yards or so I would deviate, or I would take a big step over it. And if I stepped on it accidentally, I would think, oh God, it touched me. It touched me. And when it got dark and I kept walking, I was afraid because I couldn't see it anymore. That was the worst. So maybe I'd begun to break down already, just 2 days in. Shannon and I walked together for a bit. She made an effort to catch up to me. And she smiled, as she would do. And that made it a lot better. But she stopped a couple hours after dark. And I was alone again. I knew it couldn't have been Shannon outside my tent before. She just wouldn't have been like that. I went off the road about 5 times somehow, even though it was perfectly straight. It was just so dark. And I thought, where are the sounds of animals? Where's the wind? At one point I realized there was just dust beneath my feet, and I was actually lost. I'd lost the road and never even noticed it. And I panicked, and I made myself stop and sit and maybe wait for Emma to come along. And she did. Like a half hour later, I heard one of the pumps being operated somewhere nearby. It turned out I was only 20 feet off the road, but I didn't join her. I waited until she was gone. She never saw me, I don't think. Then I kept going. It was probably almost 4 in the morning when I just couldn't go any further. Didn't even put up my tent. I just wanted to pass out. There was something so wrong here. I hadn't been able to identify 2 things which were different from hour to hour. And I couldn't identify 2 conscious thoughts I'd had. I literally did not remember what I had even been thinking about. If you asked me how long it felt like I'd walked that day, I would have said, well, frankly, maybe 5 miles or maybe 500. I do not remember.
When he was 11 years old, Peter Ricks invited a friend from his elementary school on a camping trip to Banff National Park. 3 years before, his family had walked from Canmore to Castle Junction, 19 miles through the woods, and the journey had made quite an impression on Peter, and he had asked to do it again each summer since then. Peter's friend was named Chad Kern. His parents said it was okay to go, and the Ricks family drove to Canmore on August 27th. A single night of camping at a popular hiker's shelter was planned for that night. Vaughn and Allison Ricks shared a tent, and Peter and Chad each pitched their own right beside each other, less than 20 yards away. When Peter's mother and father found that Chad was not in his tent come breakfast time, they became immediately worried. Peter himself seemed slightly dazed and uncommunicative, as if lost in a dream he couldn't wake up from. He finally told them that he had seen Chad go off in the middle of the night down the trail, daring Peter to follow, but he had been afraid to. He had waited in the tent for Chad to return, but a lot of time seemed to go by, and he hadn't known what to do. He had finally fallen asleep. A panicked search was launched, with other hikers camping at the shelter being the first to rush down the trail in search of the boy. He was found at the bottom of a gorge 2 miles away, having fallen to his death. Peter Ricks, long a withdrawn and fearful child, withdrew into a shell of guilt and shame from which he would never truly emerge. However, he remained a capable, if friendless, student, and functioned well enough to graduate from high school, then a trade school. He lived alone for many years, working in electronics repair, and seemed to be very slowly putting the tragic incident behind him. But then something happened in late spring of 2008 which changed his life powerfully for the worse.
I was walking in sort of a daze. I didn't feel rested at all. And sometime around midday, Emma came up beside me. She looked fairly pale and sick, and she began to talk to me right away. That was the end of the silence. She didn't think anything of it. It was like she had to start talking. She couldn't hold it in. I didn't even feel strong enough to tell her to stop. It felt like anything that happened to me wasn't worth struggling against, I was so weak, and the road just kept going, so I let her talk. And here it all came, the story of her life, and all her strange stories and paranoia and imagined fears. It all came out in one long, endless stream. She would not stop talking. It was aliens are living in the woods, and they look like tree stumps and stop signs, but no one can see them except her. There are people she knows who glimpsed Satan in the sky, and they'd had their minds destroyed, and they're living in asylums in Greece. She had all these details about everything that didn't make any sense. And after an hour of this, I stopped hearing her. She was making things so much worse. She was like a cavity rotting a tooth out, and I couldn't shake her. But I didn't want to, in a way. Anything was better than being alone. I didn't say more than 10 words in response to her all that time. She'd filled her head over the years with such awfulness. Her image of the world was so dark. Everything was a trap and a conspiracy, and the world was just this haunted, terrible place. And I listened to that for hours, felt like. Somewhere in there she was moving way ahead. She'd gone off to look for Shannon. She had to find Shannon, she said. And I remember that the pattern I was talking about, that yellow and black alternating pattern, like an old TV that couldn't keep its vertical hold, that came back and it filled my mind as I walked. And when the pain in my feet got bad enough, I laid down on the road thinking, if I just lie here and close my eyes, maybe the landscape will change. And when I opened my eyes and I saw that it was exactly the same, and that after almost 3 days it felt like I had gotten no closer to where I was going, I began to cry a little.
It's never added up somehow. But the psychology of these people should crumble so quickly if they didn't take any of the yoni plant. Myself, I think there was another factor, which was Emma Bailey. There are poisonous people, too. People who are the virus. They don't carry it, they are it.
Sleeping there in my tent that night, and having no idea where the others were, I was wondering if I'd be able to get out of my tent the next day. My feet were covered in blisters. I was really weak, but I had no appetite. The thought of eating my food made me ill. I considered just not moving. I was near a water pump, so I could just rest for a full day, and in another 2, maybe someone would have gotten to the end of the road, and at some point they'd come back for me. That was my logic, very off kilter. I think the next morning was the last time of lucid thought. My memory gets so unreliable after that, as if the act of going to sleep and waking up a little before dawn, as if that act somehow drove me mad. And no plant caused that. No one person caused that.
On June 7th, 2008, 11 months before the walk on Strongbone Road, Peter Ricks signed up for a Saturday bus trip at his church, a day jaunt to the centermost portion of Banff National Park, 42 miles away. The destination, Bow River, was just 1 mile from the gorge where his childhood friend Chad had fallen to his death. The day trippers, about 30 of them, had lunch by the river, and in the afternoon there was a hike into the gorge. It is believed that no one in the group that day knew of Peter's connection with the place. Ronald Garr was a church counselor who had sometimes gone hiking with Peter.
Well, he was a smart guy, but he wasn't always aware of obvious things, like he truly didn't know the geography of the area well enough to know at first where he was actually going. He just signed up because he signed up for anything in the outdoors. I was probably one of the very few people who knew what his story was, and I remember asking him, "Hey, are you going to be okay with this?" Because he'd never been back, of course, and he said he thought he'd be fine. He'd walked a lot of places in the last 30 years or whatever, and they were all the same to him. On the outside, he was certainly okay. I didn't know exactly where that little boy had died, and he didn't give any indication of seeing it that weekend.
The hike did in fact go directly past the spot where Chad Kern had fallen. Some members of the church were surprised when, about a month after the hike into the gorge, Peter came to services with his hair a much darker color than usual. He dyed it again later that year.
The hair I never said anything about, I don't think. But I asked him about the t-shirt definitely, because I saw him wear it 3 times in a row, something like that. He wasn't coming to services much anymore. He was just really sporadic. But when he did, he was always in that same t-shirt. He said he just found it at a yard sale or some other kind of offhand explanation that frankly didn't make a whole lot of sense.
Comparing Peter Ricks' signature on a driver's license renewal form from 2009 and on his tax return, it is drastically different from years before.
What he was doing, obviously, was writing with his left hand a lot. Chad Kern had been left-handed. It was another one of those strange little gestures he'd been making since the trip to the gorge. If you hold up the one photograph that was taken on that family trip, hold that up to a sketch of what Michael Spinell said he looked like when he met him in Goodloe. You'd probably get this impression of a sick joke, a man imitating the memory of this little boy who'd vanished and fallen and died. The dyed hair, the same t-shirt design he'd been wearing when they'd found him, with Kool-Aid Man on it. Not exact, mind you, but a close reproduction. And then trying to adopt the ways of a left-handed person, without a word to anyone ever about why he was doing this. You wonder how far this would have gone. You have to wonder what it was like to be in this person's mind. If it was guilt leading him to do this, and what happened to make that guilt so intense that it suddenly took him over so many years after the initial incident. All we know is that his walks got longer and longer, but he didn't like to go alone. He wanted to walk for miles and miles, but he never wanted to do it alone. Maybe for him, total strangers were a good option, because who's going to ask him about his past or why his hair is dyed?
This is where they tell me I left my tent. Just got up on day 4 and started moving, left it behind, still fully pitched. So that tells you what I was like. From the time I started walking, I felt like I was outside of my body somehow. And the walking suddenly got easier. It felt like I was being pulled along by a thread that I couldn't see, some momentum. Something that wanted me to keep going. Right down the middle of the road, I think. I remember humming a lot, the same song over and over, that Time in a Bottle song. And the impression I got of the landscape wasn't that it was just an empty plain. Even the colors seemed gone now. And it was just a black line ahead of me separating two white skies. Not one sky, one high and one low. And that impression lasted for a long time. And then the reality of the road would come back, and then it would fade again. It started to get dark, and I had never stopped once. I'm fairly sure of that for some reason. But I was walking incredibly slowly. And around the time the sun went down, there was Emma up ahead again. And she and Shannon were fighting. They were fighting in the road. Shannon had rolled on top of Emma. And they were scratching and clawing at each other. And I got in there and I broke it up. And Shannon ran off crying. She was holding her shoulder. I don't know where Emma went to.
Shannon Francis was the only one who kept any sort of record, fragmented as it was. It's tough to call it a journal, but it was from that we learned Emma had followed her too, just like she'd followed Michael Spinell, telling her stories, hounding her for hours, until apparently there was an incident between them, which we suppose Mr. Spinell witnessed.
Night came, and I guess we were only another day's walk from the end of the road, but it could have been 3 years for all I knew. I was still moving, and out of the dark, almost floating out of it, came Peter, coming in the other direction. So I guess this was the impossible vision, because of where they found his pack. It couldn't have possibly been him, they say. It was all a delusion. But it felt real. He walked past me and I stopped him. I said, "We all have to get back together or we're going to die out here. There is no end to this road. We were all lied to." But he didn't answer me. He looked right through me. And he kept going. And I was too weak to follow him. I could still feel the cold sweat on his forearm where I touched him. He was covered in sweat. I had this dream sometime the next day. I don't know where I was when it came. I must have just walked in the morning until I collapsed from the pain in my feet. In the dream, there was a woman on the road, way up ahead, and she was waiting. She was wearing black, not a dress, but the kind of clothes that someone who works in a kitchen wears. And I knew that she was a baker. I couldn't say why. She never spoke. She wasn't holding anything. But I knew this is what she was. I know she wanted me to keep going. She was going to give me something if I walked far enough. But I didn't know what. I was going to have to look for it, though. It was going to be in a cool, dark place, which I wanted so badly to hear at that point because it had gotten so hot. I couldn't drink water fast enough. All I could think of was this cool, dark place, and I was happy again. I had a reason to keep walking.
In the interviews afterward, we would ask him, you keep using this word baker, but what gave you that impression exactly? And he could never tell us specifics, or even how the thoughts were communicated to him, because it wasn't through speech. Eventually, you just have to set aside that line of questioning.
Shannon Francis's record of the walk, written on a small spiral notepad, consisted of just 3 sporadic entries. The first 2 were straight documents of the journey thus far, impressions of the setting and an inventory of her supplies. In the last one, she wrote only the following.
A very good morning, because there are no wolves and no bad people. The baker has promised me good things to eat ahead. Yum, yum.
Those were the last words she wrote on her notepad. Like the others, she left no record of any attempted outgoing cell phone calls.
A single twisted trunk of tree, branchless and dead, is a solitary witness of my passing. I try to see myself as it must, a wasted, creeping figure, bent forward by wind, a weaving blur, a dream of a figure. I tried to see, tried to know what it knows of this place, but all I can see is lightning, and all I can hear is the screaming. Michael Spinell, December 2015.
All day I alternated between very brief periods of semi-lucidity where I knew where I was and that I was moving forward toward the end of the road, and the periods where I had no conception of much of anything. The sound of my shoes on the asphalt was so loud in my ears, so loud, and the yawny plant seemed to be growing and growing around me. I would look behind me and the roots would be in motion, stretching toward me. And the one thing I would have thought was a hallucination turned out to be real, which was that the road had started to break apart, splitting this way and that. I must have had a little bit of sanity left in me, because when I saw the crack, I think I knew what it was on some level right away. It went all the way across the road and several dozen yards beyond it to the right. It was about 100 feet wide. It was such a gaping, dark thing that had done so much damage to the ground around it and created such a deep pit. A pit so deep I could see it was lethal from a football field away, that I just stopped where I was, in awe.
The sinkhole may have formed any time in the previous 2 weeks. It cut off the road entirely just 9 miles from its endpoint. The soluble bedrock of the plain in that area made it especially susceptible to cover collapse sinkholes. Water erosion set in motion by some of the wettest winters on record had created an expanding hole beneath the surface, with asphalt and sediment remaining barely stable over the top of it. Eventually, the cover could not support its own weight and had suddenly given way.
I started walking toward it. I was totally indifferent to how dangerous it was, because this was the place. This is where she wanted me to go. The baker. I was going to get something nice, but I had to go down into it. About half of it had created this sheer drop of about 15 or 20 feet into nothing, but the other half was more tiered. You could ease yourself down on ridges and shelves that had formed when the crack happened. The earth was black down there. The sun was out, and the shadows made it impossible to see anything more than 5 feet deep. I sat down on the edge of the asphalt, and I let my legs dangle over, and I lowered myself down until I had some footing. And I let go. And immediately the ground gave away, and I fell. I fell on my back, and I flung my hands out to grab anything, but I descended and hit some hard surface. There was this tremendous pain all the way up into my teeth. And I was in the dark, looking up at the sky. I saw someone down there, and her face was so strange that there was no recognition in me. This was no one I knew. She was on her back, and her legs were up and hooked over a block of asphalt, a jagged block of asphalt that had caved in like this, So it was like she was stretching out her back therapeutically. Her arms were even stretched out on either side of her, all the way out. The left arm and the right arm like this. And her palms were up. But she was staring upward. Her eyes were open and she wasn't blinking. And there was lots of blood beneath her nose. And it came to me that it was Shannon. I crawled over to her. I couldn't feel my right foot at all, so I couldn't stand. It would have been too painful. Anyway. Her eyes looked like they'd been replaced by fake ones. They looked like marbles almost. Just glass. And she wasn't breathing. And she had this expression on her face of wonder, I'd call it. Like she couldn't believe this had happened to her. She was dead. I was there with her for a while, but not because I felt anything for her. My mind wasn't capable of empathy just then. I stayed where I was because I thought I could hear whispering somewhere, and I was trying to trace it. A woman whispering to me. And I thought it was the baker. She wanted to tell me where to crawl, but she had to be really quiet for some reason. Finally, I crawled off and into the dark, where it was nice and cool. The sunlight above me disappeared because I was crawling underneath a long section of asphalt, like I was creeping into a coffin. But the ground had opened up beneath it. I could see a slope ahead of me, about 10 feet ahead, and a tiny ray of sunlight coming through the ground above me and shining down on it, like one of those pinhole cameras, And suddenly a face appeared out of the dark, right into that little bit of light, and almost jumped out. I could have almost touched the face if I had reached my arm all the way out. It was Emma. She was flat on her stomach, like a spider. She still had her backpack on, and she looked at me, and then she slid backward, right down the slope, and out of sight, without a single sound. She disappeared in the blink of an eye. And I was just alone there in the dark.
It was around, mid-September. That's when I stopped driving for Chase called me. And the road, they'd shut that down. October for the weather, sometimes you get some nasty weather blowing in. So they'd shut that road down. I just done a 48. You go back and forth for 2 straight days, and then you get 2 days off. At the end of one of those, I'd have to pep myself up with Ani. It's such a good for a long ride. One time though, I was just going down the road. Like, that stuff can really start playing with your mind and make you sometimes see things that ain't really there. And I took a little, chewed it up. You could just put the little rings into your mouth. I just wanted to get a little focus back. In the middle of the day, and I was about 40 minutes from Fort Nelson. And I see this thing. It's a piece of junk on the road. By the time I got there, it was a table. A table on the side of the road. When I got close to it, there was a woman sitting behind that table. Now, there was absolutely no one supposed to be on this road. There never was anyone on this road. So I see this, and I immediately slowed down, hit the brakes. I didn't know what she wanted. You know, I mean, you don't just stop for weird things on the side of the road. And as I'm passing this thing, she's waving me in. After I blew by her, and I went, and could see from 100 yards back. And as she's sitting there, just smiling, a strange smile, as if to say, hey, come to my table, buy something. I got some good stuff for you. But it was empty. I was about to get out of the cab, and I had this strange feeling. It was strong. It was that if I did get out and I went to that table, that woman was going to kill me. It just wasn't. She was going to kill me. And it was that strange. I would not have walked out of there alive. And I drove right on. I didn't want to know. I didn't feel better until I was all the way in Fort Nelson. It's a weird vision you can have. It just come out of nowhere, and then it disappeared into nowhere.
There's a book called Lord of the Flies, and I've never forgotten the end of it when the authorities show up and it snaps everyone in 1 second back to reality after a completely insane situation. And it was a little like that. When they were putting me into the ambulance, I felt like I was myself again, even through the pain. And they tell me I had tears pouring down my face, and I was asking where Peter was. Where's Peter? Where's Peter?
Michael Spinell had crawled out of the sinkhole and walked to the end of the road under his own power, despite the fact that he had 2 broken bones in his back and was so disoriented that he went for a full mile completely in the wrong direction. It was only because a surveyor had come out to the abandoned way station at Musqua that he was spotted. Shannon Francis and Emma Bailey had both died from their falls inside the sinkhole. Emma's body was found, with Michael Spinell's guidance, in a niche 55 feet beneath the Strongbone Road. Peter Rick's backpack was found 61 miles from the starting point of the walk, and an empty water bottle belonging to him was discovered almost a mile away to the west of the road. But despite an exhaustive search of the area, he himself was never found. It was thought that he could well have walked into the mountains to the west or simply been picked up on one of the highways that were accessible by foot. What he had sought through his walk on the Strongbone Road was a mystery.
I'm like most people. I don't get where he could have gone to. He would have eventually come across either the highway or a water source, and that's your survival right there. So he walks past those, and then, there's just no logical answer. But then, why was he out there to begin with?
I was in my office. It was fall of 2012, and a call was transferred to me from Mr. Garr. And he said he had a question for me. He said he knew I wouldn't be allowed to comment on an ongoing investigation, even one that's been cold for years, but he said one question had been absolutely haunting him, so I told him I'd try to answer it. He said, was that sinkhole really thoroughly searched, every inch of it? And I told him that, yes, of course it was. And he thanked me and hung up.
They said to me, they must have stumbled into the sinkhole probably in the dark. Maybe they were together, maybe they were alone when it happened. They don't know. But I'll always think that there was something out here waiting for us, waiting for people like us. And you could stand here out on this road like we are now, day after day, recording me, and it won't ever show itself. That's what I think about.
Signs were put up on the old access road by the fall, and they've been there ever since then, and there's no more northern access to the road anyway, so we don't really get many people, not even curiosity seekers out that way. It's just never developed into a problem. I'm convinced the only reason you'd go out there and put yourself through such a place was if you wanted to go inside yourself somehow. I mean, all the way down. You can see the roads crumbling more and more every year. In another 20, there will be not much sign of it at all.
What's left of the Strongbone Road has been relatively undisturbed since 2009. There have been no distress calls, no reports of other hikers attempting to walk it. The sinkhole was never filled by authorities, but the winds and snows of the harsher seasons that had followed slowly changed the landscape. Only 2 years after its spontaneous creation, the sinkhole was no longer recognizable as such. The earth there was merely soft, uneven and unstable, and the asphalt was completely broken, with huge pieces of it missing, swallowed whole and then forgotten by the indifferent, orphaned landscape.